Were the ancient Atlanteans star mappers and earth mappers back in the Ice Age, or were they destroyed by some galactic upheaval, as some mythologists suggest? Does the story of Atlantis even confirm some biblical accounts of the Book of Genesis? This ancient civilization, founded by the legendary figure Atlas, must have had highly advanced and accurate mapping methods which enabled these Atlanteans to successfully measure and map the Earth, thereby allowing them the ability to navigate to far-flung locations throughout the world, representing an empire of global proportions that was wiped out at the end of the Ice Age.
I absolutely do think that the story of Atlantis fits into real history. And just to put that in context, if we look at what mainstream scholars regard as the recent history of the Earth, everybody is agreed that there was an event called the last Ice Age, and that the last Ice Age came to an end rather cataclysmically about 12,000 years ago. The story of Atlantis, if we go back to the original source of the story of Atlantis, the earliest surviving source to have come down to us is the Greek philosopher Plato. And Plato, who of course knew nothing about ice ages, nevertheless set the demise of Atlantis precisely at the time that the vast ice sheets that covered huge areas of the Earth were melting down and pouring their meltwater into the oceans and raising sea levels by 400 feet all around the world.
There are over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean. And the idea that there's over 200 sunken cities in the Mediterranean is indicative that the whole Atlantic and the Mediterranean were flooded in some kind of catastrophe. These ruins are associated often with Atlantis. There's a certain type of polygonal megalithic construction that's very distinct. And you see this in these ruins that are still above water, but you see the same kind of construction in these underwater ruins too.
We think that they buried 500 people inside of the dolmen of Menga, and the stone at the end, on top, the weight of this stone is 180 tons.
Megalithic building with gigantic sculpted stone, from the Great Pyramid of Giza to Stonehenge in England to Baalbek of the ancient Canaanites, and even to the dolmens.
In this dolmen you have two clearly different parts. The long corridor, and at the end it has a chamber for the burial. We think it's only for one person or one family, probably for the chief of the village that live here. And this is the only one of the 3 of Antequera that is in the line of the summer solstice. One day of a year, the sunlight is coming through all the dolmen until the end of the chamber, 23rd of June.
All across the southern plain of Spain are these megalithic dolmens, Hormazo buildings, and they are at the base of what later would be built upon the structures by the Romans. They were the base structures at Nibla, Ronda at southern Spain, which were on rivers in the mountainous areas of the Sierra Morena Mountains, which is the richest mining area, the most ancient and richest mining area in the entire world.
One form of megalithic construction that is found all over the world is known as Cyclopean. And Cyclopean construction is giant granite or some other stone boulders that have been shaped and are usually fitted together in a jigsaw pattern where the stones are perfectly fitted and locked in together. We can find it in Spain, we can find it in Greece, in Turkey, in the Middle East. We can even find it in Mexico and other areas. And the similarity of this unusual type of construction, in my mind, is evidence of a singular source for this construction method, and I believe that is Atlantis. The capital city of Atlantis was a canal city with concentric canals and rings leading in to an inner city and port area. And Plato describes the city of Atlantis very specifically this way. The city of Carthage, built in Tunisia by the Phoenicians, was in many ways a miniature model of the capital city of Atlantis, with also these concentric circles and canals leading to an inner city. In many ways, Carthage was a rebuilding of the ancient capital of Atlantis.
Another thing that a lot of your Atlantean researchers will point to is the cross of Atlantis, is the symbol of Atlantis derived from Plato's description of the central city of Atlantis. The cross of Atlantis shows 3 concentric rings with a cross in the center with a canal emerging from the cross. And this is, again, thought to be a description of the central city of Atlantis.
I believe that Atlantis was a maritime civilization, and I believe it was based on coastlines and that it was globally distributed. I think it was all over the world. I think it was virtually everywhere, but it was on coastlines. And the reason that so little evidence that historians will accept have come down to us is because those coastlines were all submerged and are now under 100 feet of water since the end of the last ice age, and nobody has looked there. So I think actually the influence of a great lost civilization is to be found all around the world, and I think one of the places in which it was very active was in the Mediterranean and in the eastern side of what we now call the Atlantic Ocean.
These Atlanteans were savvy ancient mappers whose leader, the legendary Atlas, has always been associated with sophisticated mapping. Atlas and his fleets were well known in the ancient world as successful navigators and mappers of vast expanses of oceans and their coastlines for trade and military conquest. They used a little-known ancient method with which they could sail away and successfully find their way back to their base port. The Phoenicians of Canaan, world-renowned navigators, were also beginning to build their ships at this time. Even the ancient Greeks began to build huge trireme ships mentioned by Plato in his epic account of the warfare between the Atlanteans and the Greeks, the dominant maritime empires at this time. These ancient shipbuilding civilizations are now considered to have easily been able to navigate and exploit the lands on both sides of the Atlantic, with guidance from Atlas's mapping method.
According to the ancient Aztec legends, the original homeland of the Aztecs was a mysterious and lost land called Atlan. And the word Atlan is in fact part of the word Atlantis. So the idea, too, that the Aztecs' mysterious homeland that they left was somehow in Spain, off the coast of Spain, perhaps even the Basque areas of Spain, I think is a theory that deserves some thinking about.
Whenever the archaeologists get to work digging up ancient ruins, it's very often that something, for example, the Mayan temples, as they keep digging, they find that, okay, the current temples are built, let's say, 800, 900 AD, but they dig down deeper and deeper and they're finding things 2000, 3000 BC.
Megalithic Cyclopean structures. The Dutch in that area of Western Europe call a submerged lost civilization in their lore Atland. So we see this term ATL, Atlantic Atlan, from the Mayans all the way across to Europe. So it seems to be a common seafaring culture.
Yes, this is a very interesting point, is the references that we find from Central America to a place called Atlan, which seemed to be the home civilization from which the later historical civilization of Central America sprang. It's impossible to resist the connection between those references to a lost land called Atlan and to Plato's notion of Atlantis.
And then there's the work of Barry Fell back in the 70s America BC that makes it quite clear, at least back as far as the Phoenicians, but maybe further back than that, they were routinely visiting the New World. Again, in academia that I often like to call quackademia, this is considered illegitimate to even suggest that these ancient people were capable of intercourse with each other in terms of trade or commerce or whatever.
These ancient ruins of southern Mexico, later built upon by the Mayans, were Cyclopean megalithic structures and are strikingly similar to those ancient structures of Lixus on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, as well as those of southern Spain. This region includes the Basque country of Spain, whose people not only claim a lineage from the Atlanteans, but also refer to their lost kingdom as Atlantica.
It's interesting, too, along those lines, that the Basque language, which is very unique, is also a very similar language to the Aztec language known as Nahuatl. Both the Basque language and the Aztec language has a very curious combination of X sounds and ATL sounds, atl, quatl, kakakakakal. So when you have this Aztec language and the Basque language compared, we find a lot of curious similarities.
The suffix atl, spelled ATL, found at the end of some Mexican words, means water, and the ancient Mexican homeland is said to have been Atlan, across the water to the eastern Atlantic. So the connection to an Atlantean civilization is unavoidable. These Atlanteans quite obviously had the navigating savvy to get the job done, with a little-known ancient mapping method which allowed the surprisingly accurate mapping of many parts of the world in ancient times, even during the Ice Age.
And very interestingly, there's a whole category of maps produced between the 15th and the 17th century based on lost sources, which show the world with astonishing accuracy as it looked during the last Ice Age. I'll give you an example of this. Off the west coast of Ireland, you can find on maps from the 15th century a little circular island appears, which they call High Brazil. Such an island did not exist in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries of our era. But if you reconstruct the coastlines of the world as they looked when sea level was much lower, as it was during the last Ice Age, you find that an island was exposed above sea level in exactly the place that is indicated on those maps. How did they know it was there unless somebody was there to map it?
These Sea King maps show accurate east-west distances, and that requires a knowledge, an accurate knowledge of time. You have to measure time to get that. Now, they didn't have clocks back then. They didn't have timepieces, so they had to have another mechanism by which they could measure time. And that mechanism is the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, which would cycle once in 25,920 years. And with this rate of the wobble of the Earth's axis, the constellations of the zodiac appear to move along the horizon. They knew this rate, therefore they could measure time and therefore measure east-west distances.
For example, in Western times, the longitude was only developed and discovered, or let's say made precise, I think it's somewhere in the 1700s, 1750 or something of that nature. But there's increasing evidence that the ancients understood this full well. Moreover, where the evidence really gets commanding is when it becomes clear that the Egyptians had measured the earth, because the understanding of those measures is what gives rise to the ancient measuring system of cubits, and this is, again, universal.
Well, the references to units of measurement is the measurement that is expressed in the Great Pyramid. I think actually that the ancient Egyptian cubit is likely to turn out to be what is called an earth commensurate measure, that it is derived from an ancient system of measuring based on the knowledge of the dimensions of the earth.
The circumference of the earth is 21,600 nautical miles. And the base perimeter length of the Great Pyramid is half a nautical mile. So the circumference of the earth is 43,200 base perimeter lengths. So it's an earth commensurate measurement. And the royal cubit was derived by subdividing that half nautical mile. Now, the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid is 440 royal cubits per base side. There's 4 sides, so multiply 440 by 4 and you get 1,760. Now you divide 1,760 into half a nautical mile and you get your 20.632 inches. So it's an Earth commensurate measurement.
There's no doubt whatsoever that the Great Pyramid of Egypt does embody the dimensions of the Earth. If you take the measurement of the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid, go along and measure each of its 4 sides and add that together, and then you multiply that number by 43,200, you will get a very accurate rendition of the equatorial circumference of the Earth to within a few miles of the value that we have today. If you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by the same number, 43,200, you will get a very accurate rendition of the polar radius of the Earth, in other words, of the distance from the center of the Earth to the North Pole. Now this is really quite remarkable.
The Earth and night sky were viewed as a sphere within a sphere by several ancient civilizations. In the ancient book of the Mexicans, the Popol Vuh, it is written that the ancients could measure the round face of the Earth and the arch of the sky. Even Plato referred to the Earth as a sphere within the celestial sphere. As a result of the slow wobble over the Earth's axis, the sphere of the night sky appears to move at a constant rate of 72 years per 1 degree, known as precession. These Atlantean star mappers were apparently able to predict where on Earth the constellations of the night sky would appear at the same position, relative to the horizon. So, with this knowledge, the ancients related time to distance, the same principle upon which is based our modern nautical mile system, with arc minutes and arc seconds.
The notion or the knowledge of precession of the equinox, that's another matter that's becoming better and better established almost by the day, that the ancients knew about precession of the equinoxes way back when and write it into their legends and mythologies.
Precession of the equinox is also known as lunisolar precession, is the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun on the Earth's equator, causing a wobble, a little like a falling top, if you like. I think that they were able to measure the rate of precession with the instrument that I've rediscovered. And so yes, I do think so, and I think that they created what was known as the Great Year, which is in many cultures 25,920 years, which is one roll of the precession, if you like, one orbit of the precession. And that they broke them down into 12, and 12 is the zodiac signs, and each of those is 2,160 years long.
These structural measurements of the Great Pyramid is an almost perfect reduction of the dimensions of the Earth by a factor of 43,200. The Great Pyramid was almost certainly the embodiment of this very precise ancient precession mapping technique, and it was the base reference point for mapping the ancient world. Today, Greenwich, England is the base reference point for timekeeping and also nautical mile mapping, which is based upon the relationship of time to distance, as was the ancient system based at Giza in Egypt.
The evidence really is from the Dead Sea Scrolls as the Essenes measured the lunar calendar. But if you go back to Egypt, then obviously we talk about Thoth, Thoth meaning wisdom. And he was also god of the moon. So we can see that he involved himself in weights and measures and writing and language and all of those things, and it also says he involved himself in the moon. So measurement of the moon is the only body in the sky that's retrograde at a rate that's measurable by the eye.
Plato says that Atlantis went under 9,000 years before his time, which would put it at around 10,000 BC.
I don't think that Plato made anything up. I take Plato extremely seriously. And I think since our historians take Plato seriously in almost everything else he says, we ought to take him seriously on the issue of Atlantis. And if you take apart what Plato is saying, he's talking about a great global civilization which had a strong influence in the Mediterranean area. Plato didn't know about the Ice Age, but he did know that a great flood took place at that time. To my mind, that adds a great deal of credibility to everything that he said.
Plato's descriptions of the Atlantean Empire were so detailed that they are reflected even in biblical references. Southern Spain is also called the Hesperides. They were daughters of Atlas and granddaughters of Poseidon, Atlas's father. As Poseidon means father Sidon, and as Sidon was a son of Canaan, from the land of Canaan, a port city of which was Sidon. Cadiz, a city in southern Spain where an offshore site was located, was named after another son of Poseidon, Gades. So the tie-in of these so-called mythological Atlantean characters with biblical accounts is now becoming apparent to ancient historians.
Southern Spain is known as the Hesperides. They were daughters of Atlas, a supposedly mythological figure, but Atlas was the man of maps. He was this precession measurer who measured and mapped the earth, among others with him, the Atlanteans. And their base of operations was Tarshish, the biblical Tarshish. The Spaniards today know that Seville, which was anciently known as Tartessus, previous to that was known as Tharsin or Tharsis. That's the Tarshish of the Bible, the great merchants of southern Spain. This area also known as the Hesperides. These were the Phoenicians, the same as the Atlanteans.
Phoenician sailors were under pain of death to keep the trade routes secret, particularly the trade routes that went out into the Atlantic. Their trade routes went to Spain, up to France, and to Cornwall, where the tin and copper trade was flourishing. What the Phoenicians did was try to keep their trade routes a secret, and so they fostered these ideas that the Atlantic was impassable to other ships, so that only their ships would have the courage and the knowledge to go beyond the Straits of Hercules into the Atlantic.
Plato also elaborates on the gold, copper, silver, and tin mines of the Sierra Morena Mountains of southern Spain, which were by far the richest in the ancient world. It is presumed that they were the lifeblood of the Atlantean shipping empire with its mineral wealth, and these Atlanteans clearly had the ability to transport these minerals to the eastern Mediterranean to trade with the Greeks, Minoans, Canaanites, and Egyptians. So it would seem that the Atlanteans were truly the dominant shipping and military power in the western Mediterranean and eastern Atlantic. Their empire most likely ranged from Gibraltar in the west, northward to the rich tin mines of Cornwall, England, where are found the now submerged sites referred to as Avalon, and eastward from Gibraltar to as far as Italy and Libya. The almost identical Cyclopean megalithic ruins found in those regions, both onshore and now submerged, support and confirm Plato's account.
I feel that what actually happened was that these people had a land which was bounded by the sea as opposed to bounded by the land. That they followed the trade routes of the trade wind routes as we know them today and the local Atlantic currents, and they travelled around the basin of the Atlantic Ocean. And so they existed on the peripheries of France, of Britain, of Scandinavia, and then down the coasts of Spain, round the north coasts of Africa, across from the Cape Verde Islands to Canaries, to the northern parts of America, the Caribbean, and back round the route again up from Newfoundland.
As evidenced by the submerged megalithic ruins found in various parts of the world, some of which are on the shallow seafloor of the Gibraltar region, off Spain at Tarifa, Chipiona, Rota, Huelva, as well as off Lixus, Morocco, it is only now becoming clear that the tremendous sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age consumed the coastline portions of these ancient civilizations, preeminent among them being these port and citadel structures of the Atlantean Empire. Some of the maps of the Ice Age Sea Kings show mapping reference points radiating from the area of the Upper Nile Delta, where the Great Pyramid is located. This indicates that the ancient prime meridian, the base reference point for the ancient navigators, extended through the location of the Great Pyramid of Giza. So it would seem that the Egyptians were not only master builders, but also adept navigators, like the Canaanite Phoenicians, some of whom were the Atlanteans.
the maps themselves testify to an ancient project to completely map the whole world. In order to map the whole world, you need big ships, which are capable of enormous journeys to actually visit all of these places around the world. And these maps show the world in great detail as it looked during the last ice age, not in the Middle Ages. And these maps incorporate extremely accurate longitude relationships.
In the Middle Ages, a number of maps did exist of the Atlantic, and they often showed across the Atlantic a mysterious land known as Antilla, or the Antilles. And this area was associated with Atlantis. St. Brendan, other seafarers were known to go out into the Atlantic in search of this mysterious island of the Antilles. Later, historians and cartographers identified the Antilles with many of the Caribbean islands. And in fact, they're called the Antilles today.
The Greek philosopher Aristotle called the Phoenicians the Antilhas, who called themselves the Cana Anu, which means offspring of the Canaan. So, according to the biblical timeline, these ancient world navigators were operating as the Atlantis Empire during the Ice Age, which, according to conventional ancient historians, ended around 10,000 BC, when the sea level was rising due to the melting of Ice Age ice packs, and the Middle East, Egypt, and the Indus Valley of India were drying out with the end of the Ice Age, causing the mass migration of people groups. Among them, the Sea People, who were the displaced Atlanteans as their civilization was being destroyed.
The way the technology, the Atlantean technology was lost is inferred by Plato, and he describes how they had a divine essence within them, and that over time this divine essence diminished. And when Zeus heard about this from his home in the center of the universe, as Plato describes, he sent his wrath. We do know that periodically galaxies go into what are called their active galactic nucleus phase, where they sprout out just these incredible cosmic energies. And there is evidence, according to some theoretical physicists and others, that Earth did suffer such a cataclysm. So I would go along with the idea that that was what actually caused the destruction of Atlantis, was this cyclical cataclysmic destruction, and literally destroyed the civilization of Atlantis.
Almost all would agree that Atlantis did succumb to the sea because of the end of the Ice Age, when the polar ice caps melted and the water poured into the sea rapidly, raising sea level and submerging all these megalithic structures which are now on the shallow seafloor.
Particularly as we discover more and more megalithic cities underwater, we're amassing better proof of this ancient civilization we'll call Atlantis. These cities just were not built underwater. They had to be built before these oceanic level changes. So whenever that was, that is, at least how ancient we can start to date these cities. And that is putting us back into this time frame of Atlantis.
The submerged megalithic ruins of the Gibraltar area, as well as those off Egypt, Lebanon, Greece, India, and Japan, should be more fully investigated. But clearly, mainstream scientists and historians have shown a reluctance to do so, because they would have to rewrite their chronology of ancient history. These offshore sites were obviously the port cities of the ancient Atlantean civilization, which clearly flourished during the Ice Age, whose navigators measured and thereby mapped the Earth with astonishing accuracy, using the precession mapping methods used by Atlas, the founder of the legendary and truly historical maritime empire of Atlantis.